The boardroom on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows and leather chairs that cost more than I made in 3 months, and I had spent 4 minutes standing outside its glass wall holding a tray of coffee that nobody had asked for, watching a deal worth $480 million come apart at it seems. The lead attorney on the opposing side had closed his portfolio. The man sitting across the table from him, George Harrick, CEO of the company that Harwick Capital intended to acquire, had his phone face up in front of him and the expression of a man who has already decided and is simply waiting for the room to catch up to the fact. Victoria Sloane stood at the head of the table. She was 41 years old and ran Harwick Capital with a precision that the financial press described in the same sentence as the firm's annualized returns. She was currently looking at George Harrick the way a person looks at a fire alarm that has gone off at exactly the wrong moment. She had not looked at me once. The glass door was propped open. I stepped inside with the tray. She turned then. One full assessment. Shoes to badge. Building operations. Coffee tray. The calculation was fast and total, and I watched it happen behind her eyes. She said, "You're not my problem right now." And she turned back to the table. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That was a Tuesday in September. 4 days before the scheduled close of an acquisition Harwick Capital had spent 11 months building. 14 hours before the call, I made from a stairwell on the 41st floor that put George Harrick back in his chair. 17 days before the conversation I had with Victoria Sloane in that same boardroom, just the two of us, the city going dark below us, and the leather chair across from her empty until she asked me to sit in it. None of that had happened yet. On the morning of that Tuesday, I was in my kitchen at 5:40 making June's lunch. Peanut butter on whole wheat, the crust left on because June had decided sometime around age 5 that removing the crust was wasteful and had committed to this position with the particular stubbornness of someone who has found a principle and intends to stand on it. Half an apple, sliced thin. 3 animal crackers in a separate compartment because the crackers could not touch the apple or the apple would make them soft, and soft animal crackers, according to June, defeated the entire purpose of animal crackers. She was 7 years old, and she had opinions about crackers. She had opinions about most things, delivered with the calm authority of someone who has thought them through and is now simply reporting her findings. She came into the kitchen at 5:50 with her hair still down from sleep and her stuffed dog Fig tucked under one arm. Fig had lost his left eye in a washing machine incident the previous winter and been repaired with a brown button that was close but not quite matching. June had considered this development for about 2 days and then declared that it made him more interesting. She sat at the table and propped Fig against a napkin holder and ate her cereal with the focused efficiency of someone who has places to be. "Is today the day Mr. Bram brings the class hamster home?" I said, "No." She considered her spoon. "That's next Friday. Mr. Bram says it's a big responsibility." "It is. I would be very responsible. I know, but some people in my class would not be." She said this without naming names and without needing to, in the tone of someone who has done her assessment and is confident in her conclusions. I finished wrapping the sandwich, put the lid on the cracker compartment, zipped the lunchbox. Outside the kitchen window, the city was still mostly dark, that particular pre-dawn where the edges of the sky have the suggestion of light but aren't committing to it. We left at 7:10. June wore her jacket with a yellow zipper pull and carried Fig in her backpack because Fig went everywhere. I carried her pack in my own bag, which held the work thermos and the logbook I kept for building operations and the paperback I had been meaning to finish for 6 weeks and had not gotten past page 93. She held my hand crossing the first street and let go at the corner. She was 7 and had a reputation to consider among the other children arriving at the school gate. I understood this. I waited until she was through the gate before I turned back toward the train. Harwick Capital occupied the top 12 floors of a glass building in the financial district whose windows reflected the structures around it and gave the whole tower the appearance of being slightly too large for the space it occupied. I had worked there for 2 years and 7 months. My key opened the mechanical room on the 20th floor. My logbook went back to the 1st January, filled twice daily in the same handwriting, dates and readings and maintenance notes, and nothing extraneous. I knew every elevator by its particular sound when the doors opened and closed. I knew that the air handling unit on the 38th floor ran 2 degrees warm on the east side, and that the discrepancy was not a problem yet, but would become one before the following summer. I had written that finding in a logbook with a recommended fix and a timeline and a note for the building manager, and the building manager had decided the fix required too much service interruption and had deferred it indefinitely. I had noted that decision too, and the date on which it was made, and the signature I had asked for and received to confirm the deferral was theirs and not mine. I noted things. I had been noting things for a long time and saw no reason to stop. My badge said Daniel Reed, Building Operations. The building super called me Dan. June called me Dad. The logbook in my bag, the one no one at Harwick had asked to look at or known existed, had my full name on the inside cover in the handwriting I used before I had taught myself to write smaller, to take up less page. The full name included a middle initial, R, the same letter that had appeared on the door of an office on the 16th floor of a building 4 blocks east of here, 9 years ago, in the firm name printed on glass, Reed, Osei, and Partners. On the top shelf of my closet at home, behind June's winter boots and a box of her drawings from when she was 3, there was a padded envelope I had not opened in 4 years. I knew what was inside because I had put it there myself. A business card, a photograph of a conference room where 8 people sat around a table looking at a projection screen. I was one of the 8, the one standing near the screen, pointing at something in the upper left corner. The other 7 people in the photograph were looking at the screen. George Harrick, seated third from the left, was looking at me. The third item in the envelope was a letter, typed on company letterhead, signed by hand, dated 3 weeks after the photograph was taken. I had read it once when it arrived, and once after I put it in the envelope, and had not read it since. I knew what it said. I did not need to read it to know. My former partner Frank Osei had called me 4 years ago, 8 months after my wife died, when I was still not sleeping in any way that could be called rest, and asked me what I was doing with myself. Frank was not a man who made social calls, which meant the question was sincere. I told him I was raising my daughter. He let that sit for a moment with the particular respect of someone who understands what it means to step out of the life you have both been living. Then he asked if I needed work. I said yes. Not a role, not a position. Work. He made a call to someone who managed a building. That was how I had come to be here, in this building, in this badge, in this logbook. I had not reached back into the world that Frank's call came from. Not once. The messages from former colleagues had arrived with decreasing frequency as it became clear that I was not returning. And then eventually they had stopped, which was accurate information about the situation. The thing about a life you have stepped out of is that it does not cease to exist when you leave it. The deals I had structured were still running. The companies I had helped were still operating. The relationships I had built across 15 years of work, in which I had never once made a promise I did not intend to keep, are still there, intact, because that kind of thing does not erode simply because you stop appearing in rooms. I had known this, abstractly, for 4 years. On the morning of the Tuesday in September, it had not felt relevant to anything in my immediate day. By 8:15, I was in the mechanical room on the 28th floor running the morning readings. By 9, I was on the 41st floor replacing a fluorescent fixture that had been on a maintenance list for 2 weeks, working from a 6-foot ladder with the fixture cover-balanced on my forearm. At 9:40, my phone rang, and the building manager asked if I could handle a coffee delivery to the 42nd floor boardroom. The catering cart had developed a wheel issue. The regular catering staff was handling 2 simultaneous events on lower floors. The meeting starting at 10:15 was important. The people in it were important. The coffee, he said, was probably more important than he was making it sound. I said yes. I finished the fixture. I went down to the catering station on the 39th floor and loaded the tray with the correct cups and the correct setup and took the elevator to 42. I heard the meeting through the glass before the door was fully open. George Harrick's voice was one I had not heard in 4 years. I recognized it in exactly the way I recognized the sounds of the building's systems, with a specificity that did not need to warm up. His attorney beside him was using the phrase adjusted consideration, which in the language of deals that are ending means the side that is leaving is being polite about leaving. Harrick was not responding to his attorney. Harrick not responding was not a pause. It was a conclusion. I stepped through the prop door with the tray. Victoria Sloane turned from the window and looked at me. Building operations. Coffee tray. No title on the badge that warranted a second look. She said what she said. I set the tray on the credenza near the door. I poured a cup. I set it where it would be within reach and out of the way. I was quiet about all of it, the way I was quiet about most things in this building, because quiet was what the building needed from me, and I had never had trouble giving it. George Harrick glanced at me from across the table. He looked away. Then he looked back. It was the particular look of a man who has seen a face he associates with a fixed point in his own history, filed it under impossible given the context, and is now running a second calculation against his own certainty. His attorney said his name. Harrick did not answer. He was still looking in my direction. I lifted the empty tray and walked out. The door closed behind me. In the elevator lobby, I pressed the button for 41 and stood with the tray and listened to the building. The pull of the HVAC. The faint click of the elevator car arriving. The way it settled when the doors opened. June had asked me once how I knew when a machine was working right. I told her it was the same as knowing when a person was working right. You listen for what is not being said. The elevator doors opened. I got in. I had 14 hours before I made the call. Victoria Sloane had been at her desk since 6:15 that morning, which was not unusual, and had eaten half a container of Greek yogurt at 7:45, standing at the window with the city spread below her and her phone in the other hand, which was also not unusual. What was unusual was that she had eaten the yogurt without tasting it and had been staring at the same block of buildings for 11 minutes without seeing them, which her assistant Marcus would have recognized as a sign that something in the deal architecture had shifted in a way that was not yet visible to the rest of the team. Marcus was right about most things that involved reading Victoria's attention patterns. He was 26 years old and understood her professional habits the way a good navigator understands current. He brought her second coffee at 8 and said nothing about the half-finished yogurt still on the desk. The acquisition of Harrick Industrial had been 11 months in the making. It was the largest deal Harwick Capital had pursued in its 9-year history, and it was in the specific calculation that Victoria ran for every major transaction, the one that would shift the firm from a respected mid-size fund into something that the institutional investors took seriously at a different tier. Not just the return it would generate if the integration went as projected, the signal it would send, the category it would move them into. She had spent 11 months on the due diligence, the financing structure, the regulatory filings, the relationship management. She had flown to Denver 4 times to meet with Harrick's board. She had restructured the offer twice based on concerns Harrick's team had raised. Not because the concerns were insurmountable, but because she had learned early in her career that the deals that last are the ones where both sides feel they have been heard. She was thorough in the way that people become thorough when they have seen what happens when they are not. Her chief strategist, Ryland Park, had been on the deal since month 2. He was 38, had his MBA from Wharton and his undergraduate from Georgetown, and wore the combination with the ease of someone who had understood early that credentials were a form of currency and had invested accordingly. He was good at financial modeling. He was precise in his analysis and fast with the numbers and absolutely certain in his assessments, which was useful in the early stages of a deal and became a liability in the stages where certainty was the last thing the situation required. Victoria had learned to use his certainty and to compensate for it. She had not yet decided whether the compensating was worth the cost. At 9:15 that Tuesday morning, Ryland had stood in her office doorway and told her the meeting would go fine. Harrick's hesitation last week was a negotiating posture. His attorney was performing caution, not communicating it. The adjusted consideration they had offered was objectively favorable to Harrick's shareholders, and Harrick knew it. The meeting would close the final terms, and they would be at the signing by Friday. Victoria had looked at him for a moment. Then she had said, "Make sure the 42nd floor is set up by 10. Ryland had taken this as agreement. It was not agreement. It was a decision to let the morning unfold without the additional friction of explaining to someone why his certainty was making her nervous. The meeting started at 10:15 and began to fail by 10:35. George Harrick had arrived with his attorney and a junior associate who took notes on a legal pad in handwriting too small to read from across the table. He had been courteous in the way of a man whose manners are structural rather than warm, the manners of someone who behaves correctly because he has decided it costs less than behaving incorrectly, not because he requires anything from the people he is being courteous toward. He had listened to Ryland's opening presentation for 22 minutes without interrupting. He had asked 3 questions. The first 2 were ones they had anticipated, and Ryland had answered them well. The third was not one they had anticipated, and it concerned a specific clause in the representations and warranty section that Ryland had considered settled at the previous meeting. Harrick did not consider it settled. Harrick's position on it had shifted in the past week in a way that neither Ryland nor Victoria had been tracking, because the information about why it had shifted was in a conversation that Harrick had with someone outside their network, and none of their intermediaries had picked it up. Ryland tried to walk Harrick back to the previous position using logic, which was the wrong instrument for the moment. The previous position had been acceptable to Harrick last week because of something he had been told or shown since then that had changed the calculation. Logic applied to a change calculation does not reverse the change. It adds friction to a room that already has too much. Victoria had watched this happening and had tried to redirect. Twice she had moved the conversation toward a different framing, a different piece of the deal structure where there was still room to work. Both times Harrick's attorney had steered them back to the representations clause. That was when the catering door had opened and a man in a building operations badge had come in with the coffee tray, and she had looked at him and looked away and said what she said. She had not thought about it again during the meeting. Her attention was on the room. By 11:40, Harrick's attorney was closing his portfolio. By noon, Harrick's team was in the elevator. Ryland stood at the window after they left and said the word unprecedented in a way that suggested he was filing it under something external, something that had happened to the deal rather than something the deal had produced. Victoria sat at the head of the table and looked at the city through the glass and did not say anything for 2 minutes. Then she said they needed Harrick's direct line, and she needed it in the next 30 minutes, and whoever could get it should do so now. Nobody got it in the next 30 minutes. The problem was not that Harrick's number was inaccessible. The problem was that Harrick had decided not to receive calls from Harwick Capital today, and a man who has made that decision is unreachable through the channels that Harwick Capital controlled. Ryland tried 2 intermediaries. One did not call back until 3 in the afternoon. The other called back at 1:30 and said Harrick's office had indicated he was traveling and not available. Harrick was not traveling. Victoria knew this because she knew how Harrick's office described unavailability, and it was never traveling, and she had known it from the first time she'd heard that word used this way. A year into her career, when a man she had been negotiating with used it about himself, and she had understood immediately that it meant the same thing a closed door means. She went back to her office at 1 and closed her own door, which she did not do often. What no one on her team saw that afternoon was what happened in the brief silence between her closing the door and the moment she sat down. She stood at the window with her arms at her sides and looked at the city, not the way she had looked at it that morning, cataloging and calculating. She looked at it the way a person looks at something that has been there through everything and does not care about any of it, which can be steadying or devastating depending on the day. Her father had gone bankrupt when she was 21 and a junior in college. Not gradually. Over one season, in the particular way that real estate debt cascades when the timing is wrong and the leverage is too high and no one comes in to stop the fall. He had spent years building and 6 months losing everything he built, and she had watched it with the helpless attention of someone too young to intervene and old enough to understand exactly what was happening. She had graduated, gone to work, and chosen a profession where the instrument of control was financial structure rather than physical structure, because financial structure, done correctly, did not fall the way buildings did. She did not think about this often. She thought about it on the days when a thing she had built was in the process of falling, and she recognized the sensation and worked through it, which she was doing now, at the window, for 45 seconds before she sat down and opened her laptop and returned to the problem. She did not see Daniel for the rest of the afternoon. He passed the 42nd floor twice. Once at 2, when he was checking the thermostat in the corridor that ran alongside the boardroom and could hear, through the closed door, Rylan on a call using the word leverage in 4 different consecutive sentences with decreasing accuracy. Once at 4:15, when he was collecting a maintenance order from the floor supervisor's desk near the elevator bank, and the boardroom door was open and the table inside was covered in printed documents, and Ryland's associate was color-coding a printed deal sheet with highlighters in a pattern that suggested urgency and produced no new information. Daniel looked at none of this. He took the maintenance order, thanked the supervisor, and went back to the stairwell. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He picked June up from aftercare at 5:30. She was in the middle of a conversation with her friend Petra about whether a robot could ever be a real friend, a question they had been circling for 2 weeks, and she finished her point before she came to the door, which he appreciated because unfinished points bothered her for the rest of the evening if they were left unfinished. On the train home, she sat next to him with her backpack between her feet and Fig on her lap and told him about a school project she had been assigned. Each student was to write 1 page about someone they admired and explain why. She had already decided on her subject. She told him who it was. He looked at her. "You decided on me," he said. "You're good at fixing things," she said, with the straightforward certainty of someone making a factual observation. "And you do it when nobody's watching. Mr. Bram says that's the best kind of good." She adjusted Fig on her lap. "Also, you make the best animal cracker system." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to say about me?" he asked. She thought about this with great seriousness, tapping her collarbone the way she did when she was working through something. That you know when things are broken before other people notice, and that you fix them anyway, even if the thing that's broken doesn't know you fixed it. The train ran for 2 more stops before either of them said anything else. At home, he made pasta and a salad, and they ate at the kitchen table with Fig propped in his usual position against the napkin holder and June telling him at length about Petra's theory on robot feelings, which Petra had revised since last week to include the possibility that robots could feel things but in a different shape than people felt them. He asked June what she thought about that. She said she thought a shape was a shape and feeling was feeling, and she wasn't sure the shape changed what it was. He washed the dishes. She did her homework at the kitchen table, and he sat across from her with his paperback open. And at a certain point, he stopped reading and looked at the page without seeing it, thinking about George Harrick's face in that boardroom. The look of a man running a second calculation against his own certainty. He put June to bed at 8:30. She asked him to read 2 chapters instead of 1 because the story had gotten to a part where something was about to happen, and it was impossible to stop where it was stopping. He read 2 chapters. The thing that was about to happen happened and was resolved, and she was satisfied. He turned off her light. He checked that Fig was positioned correctly, which June required, and went back to the kitchen. He sat at the table for a long time. He was not thinking about the deal. He was thinking about George Harrick in that boardroom, the look that had crossed his face when he saw Daniel with a coffee tray. Harrick was not a man who made decisions carelessly or reversed them without reason, and the reason he had walked away from a deal that was objectively favorable to his shareholders was not the representations and warranties clause, or not only. Daniel had been in enough rooms to know the difference between a man negotiating and a man who had lost confidence in the people across the table. Harrick had lost confidence in something in the past week, and whatever it was had been enough. The deal could still close. Not through Ryland's intermediaries, and not through Victoria's channels. It could close through one conversation with one person if that person was willing to take a call from a number that was not currently in their system, from a name they had not heard said aloud in 4 years. Daniel sat with this for a while longer. At 9:50, he got up from the table and went to the kitchen counter and stood there with his phone in his hand. He opened his contacts. The contact was not there because he had not saved it in this phone. He knew the number the way he knew the floor plans of the buildings he worked in, from a period when that kind of knowledge was simply what the work required. He went into the hallway, to the closet, and moved June's winter boots and the box of drawings. He did not open the envelope. He knew what was inside it. What he needed was not in the envelope. What he needed was in himself, in the same place all the things he had carried out of that other life still lived, intact, unchanged by the time he had spent away from them. He went back to the kitchen. He dialed. 4 rings. Then a voice he recognized the way he recognized the sounds of the building. Different context, same signal. "This is Harrick." "George," Daniel said. "It's Daniel Reed." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds, which in the language of men who do not waste time, said more than a paragraph would have. "Daniel Reed," Harrick said, and then, with a particular quality that Daniel had not heard from anyone in 4 years, the quality of a man who is choosing his words carefully because the person on the other end has earned that care. "Where have you been?" "Fixing things," Daniel said. A pause, then something that was almost a sound of recognition, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to it. "I need 30 minutes of your time tomorrow morning," Daniel said. "Before 9. "You have it," Harrick said. No qualification. No counter. The way a man answers when the person asking has already deposited enough that the answer is preloaded. "I'll come to you," Daniel said. "I know where your office is." "I know you do," Harrick said. "You pick the location." They agreed on 8 o'clock. Daniel ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet of the apartment, the refrigerator running, the city below the window, doing what the city did at 10 in the evening, and then he put his phone face down on the counter and went to bed. He did not call Victoria. He did not call Ryland. He did not call the building manager. He had not been asked to save the deal. He had not been asked to do anything beyond deliver a coffee tray to a room where he was not a problem. But the deal could be saved, and he knew how to save it. And there was a 24-year-old driver named Xavier on the circuit with a company whose value would fund his team for 6 years waiting for it, and 112 Harrick industrial employees whose futures were attached to what happened in that room, and a 7-year-old girl 2 doors down the hall who had written in her school project that her father fixed things when nobody was watching. He slept without his mind cycling through it. That was the advantage of having done this before. You learned, eventually, to put the problem down between the time you identified the solution and the time you executed it. At 5:40 the next morning, he was in the kitchen making June's lunch. Peanut butter on whole wheat. Apple sliced thin. 3 animal crackers in the separate compartment. At 7:10 they left. At 8 o'clock he was in George Harrick's office, not in his building operations jacket, in a gray wool coat he had not worn in 2 years that June had pointed at in the closet once and asked about. He had told her it was for important days. She had accepted this and returned to whatever she had been doing. George Harrick stood when Daniel came through the door. They shook hands across a desk that Harrick's company had occupied for 30 years, and in the particular grip of that handshake was the weight of what had happened once, in a conference room with 8 people and a projection screen, when Daniel had found the thing that nobody else in the room had been looking for, and had said so, quietly, and had been right. "Tell me what happened," Daniel said, and I sat down. Harrick told him. By 8:40 Daniel understood not just what had gone wrong, but why, and what would have to be said, by whom, and in what sequence to make it right. At 8:50 he made 2 calls. At 9:15 he called Harrick's attorney directly and outlined a modification to the representations clause that addressed the underlying concern Harrick had not stated out loud in the boardroom because he had not been asked the right question. He sent one message to Victoria Sloane's direct line at 9:20. Not to her assistant. Not to Ryland. To her. The message had 2 sentences. He identified himself by his full name and his building operations role, and said that if she wanted a path to closing the Harrick deal by Friday, she should call this number, now, before 10 o'clock. Then he sat in the lobby of Harrick's building and waited. His phone rang at 9:28. Victoria's voice on the phone had the careful, stripped-down quality of someone who has set aside their usual register because the situation requires it. She asked who he was. He told her. She asked how he had gotten Harrick to take a call. He said he would explain that in person. She asked why she should bring a building operations employee into a 9-figure negotiation. He said, because your other options haven't worked since noon yesterday, and Harrick's attorney is expecting a revised clause draft by 2 o'clock this afternoon. A silence. Then, be here at 11. He was there at 11. Ryland was in the conference room when Daniel walked in, and the look on his face moved through 3 distinct phases in the span of 2 seconds. recognition of a badge, confusion about the context, then a particular kind of stillness that settles over people who are confident enough in their own authority to be genuinely unsure whether to be amused or offended. He looked at Victoria. Victoria did not look at him. She looked at Daniel and said, "Tell me what you found." Daniel sat down at the table. He opened nothing. He had brought no portfolio, no laptop, no printed deck. He had brought the information in his head, the way he had always carried information, organized and accessible and present when needed. He explained what Harrick had told him that morning. He explained what concern, unstated in Tuesday's meeting, sat underneath the representations clause dispute. He outlined the modification, in plain language, that would address the actual problem rather than the visible one. He spoke for 11 minutes. Victoria asked 4 questions. He answered each of them with the kind of directness that does not require reinforcement because it is simply accurate. When he finished, Ryland said, "This is all contingent on Harrick actually coming back to the table." Daniel said, "He'll be here at 2. Harrick arrived at 1:58. He came through the conference room door, and his eyes moved across the table and found Daniel before they found Victoria, before they found Ryland, before they completed any professional assessment of the room. He extended his hand across the table and said, "Daniel, not Mr. Reed, not the building operations man. Daniel, the way you say the name of someone whose judgment you have trusted with something that mattered." Ryland's pen stopped moving. One of Harrick's junior associates leaned toward her colleague and said something too quiet to hear, but the look on the colleague's face when she heard it was the look of someone filing a significant piece of new information. Victoria watched all of it. She watched the way Harrick sat down differently once Daniel was in the room, the posture of a man who has found the correct frequency and can now function properly. She watched Daniel across the table, the way he listened, the economy of his words, the way the room organized itself around him without his doing anything to produce that effect. She watched Ryland watching the same thing with the expression of someone who has just understood that the map he has been navigating by is missing a substantial portion of the territory, and that the missing portion is the part that mattered. The revised clause was agreed upon at 3:15. The signing was confirmed for Friday. When Harrick stood to leave, he shook hands around the table in sequence. When he reached Daniel, he held the handshake a half-second longer and said, quietly, "I sent a letter to your house 4 years ago. I wasn't sure you got it." Daniel said he had gotten it. Harrick nodded, the nod of a man who needed to know that and now did, and walked out. The room cleared. Ryland gathered his materials without speaking and left. The associates filed out behind him. Victoria and Daniel were alone at the table. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You designed deals like this one before. Deals this size." It was not a question. You walked away from it. Also not a question. "My wife died," Daniel said. "My daughter was 3. Victoria looked at the table. Whatever she was sorting through in that moment, she sorted through it without performing it, and he found that he respected this about her. She was not a person who reached for sentiment before she had earned it. "I told you that you weren't my problem," she said. "You were in the middle of losing something you'd spent 11 months building." "That's not a defense of it." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked about June. He told her. The crackers in the separate compartment. The stuffed dog with the mismatched button eye. The school project. Victoria listened the way she read financial models, with full attention and no performance of reaction. And when he finished, she was quiet in a way that had a different texture than her professional quiet. Something in it that was adjacent to recognition. What kind of shape that recognition had, he did not ask. She offered him a position on the deal team. Not a full return to the professional life he had left. A consulting engagement defined by him, on his schedule, built around June's. She said he could name his terms. He said he would think about it. She said that was fair. He picked up June from aftercare at 5:30. She was still deep in the robot conversation with Petra, and she finished her point before she came to the door, and he was glad because unfinished points stayed with her. On the train, she sat beside him with Fig on her lap and asked if it had been an important day. He thought about the table and Harrick's face and the 11 minutes he had spoken from memory into a room that had stopped knowing what to do, and Victoria's voice when she asked him about his daughter. "Yes," he said. June nodded. She looked at Fig. I'm going to give you a good paragraph, she told Fig. In the project. She adjusted his button eye. You've been through a lot. Daniel looked out the train window at the city moving past. The position he had once held, the name on the glass, the deals, the rooms full of people waiting for him to speak, all of it was still there if he wanted it. It had not gone anywhere. That was the thing about who you were. It did not erode while you were looking the other way. He would give Victoria his answer on Monday. Tonight, he was going to make pasta and read 2 chapters and make sure Fig was in the correct position before he turned off the light. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.